Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, please be upstanding for President Michael D. Higgins.
President Higgins, ladies and gentlemen, that welcome, I think, says it all in respect of how pleased and honoured we are to have you visit Corrymeela in this, the final celebration of the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Corrymeela community. It must be nearly a year ago that we wrote to your office asking if you would honour us with your presence during our 50th year. And this particular event seems a very appropriate one for your visit. It is the 50th anniversary of a speech that Terence O'Neill made at Corrymeela at the opening of the centre, at which he urged on his fellow people from Northern Ireland reconciliation across the two communities, a famous address which regretfully didn't have the long-term impact which we might have hoped for. But we've had a series of events over the last year, and this really is the final event in our 50th anniversary year. So we're delighted, President Higgins, that you and your wife have joined us on this particular occasion. When we thought about how we would celebrate our 50th anniversary, we did think that we would like to reprise the conference which we had 50 years ago. And we were able to join with the Irish Association in this endeavour, because coincidentally the Irish Association wanted to mark the centenary of the momentous events in 1916. So it seemed a happy coincidence that we could join together to develop this conference on the theme of living well together beyond 2016. So while last night we looked back at the origins of 1916 and the momentous events which took place there with Paul Bew, and then this morning we looked at a report which had been commissioned by the Irish Association from the Institute of Conflict Research at Queen's into the present state of North-South relationships, which reviewed economic, social, cultural relationships within the two parts of this island. This afternoon we had a political panel, some of whose representatives I hope have been able to stay for this evening. But this evening, we're delighted to welcome you, sir, to look at living well together beyond 2016. I don't know that I really need to introduce you, not least because we had in the programme for the conference biographical details, but perhaps suffice it to say that you are a distinguished statesman, author, poet, writer, and academic. And that's only the short version of the biography. But sir, many thanks for gracing us with your presence, and can I invite you to speak to us this evening?
Dear friends, the good core, an gaedal sias, tishtul gaelgid an ta ag makara me jimse. It's pleasure dom veilur jantas an oit oilen sha. Et a broner am gwyl kedur re shan sam kurta hurter Corrymeela, ac an oit oilen sha I malen kastel. Siv tafak a mwintrish le lacade agus kniasa had a winter an oilen sha. Asur firkin folshet a barish of room henis ref me fan kedes ita ta test nam gar a mille make. Dear friends, living well together beyond 2016 My first subversive thought was, I hope they don't think I'm going to speak about a Martha Sin and Martha Nussbaum. Living well, it's something you should hold though for the future, I think. There's a great power in that short word, well, and wellness, and so on, but for another day. When I was invited to perform an act, when anyone is invited to perform an act of public remembering, and to do so in relation to what are assumed to be foundational, if contested, narratives, a protective humility surely suggests that one should try to anticipate how such an act of commemoration itself will be remembered in the future. What motivations will be construed as informing our words. And one must care, but then not allow such care as to become an inhibition of what, however temporary the truth that emerges. It is important to appreciate not just what the commemoration of a particular event indicates, but also how it in its turn will fit with competing narratives in the future, how it will fall on the ears of the other. Commemoration then requires a critical engagement with its consequences. It demands from us, public persons, elected representatives and community activists alike, a thorough reflection as to what is appropriate for even a temporary excursion into what from diverse sources and in different ways might tentatively be called collective memory. This year in Ireland, we are commemorating the centenary of two deeply interrelated events in Irish history. Two events which unfolded in the same wider context of a European and global war, but also two events that are connected in profound and complex ways to a whole sequence of other developments in the previous and subsequent decades. We are required, I suggest, to accept the importance of context, but also the fact that our doing so changes the context itself. We are challenged to be left with, in the end, what is the capacity to forge a public discourse, such a one as can accommodate both the Easter Rising of 1916, a founding moment in the Irish Republic's journey to independence, and the Battle of the Somme, for example, a terrible loss of lives which has acquired such symbolic centrality for the Unionist tradition on our island. I respect that. How then should we set about publicly remembering those seminal events that stirred Ireland 100 years ago? A difficulty lies surely in the setting of boundaries, not just to interpretation, but to the range of the regress in memory itself. Remember is an active verb. Where are you going to stop? And then so also to forget is in fact an active verb. How far back does one go? Does one decide on periods of change as well in terms of their impact on population? Is one free to submit the rationalizations of conquest or occupation, defeat and dispossession to critique? If all of this involves in contemporary times a revision of foundational myths and beliefs of the past in the name of peace and hope in the present, can it not, while including the positive values of freedom, equality and participation, not also introduce an analysis of those impulses that are created by conflict? Can our revisions move easily and equally between the aspirations of communities seeking to get past the memory of old wounds so as to live in the present, not to lose the future, and on the other hand, demands of those who read or cherish as forms of intimacy itself the legacy of empire differently, and who may not agree, for example, that World War I, with its catastrophic destruction of young lives, was anything other than heroic. My view is that commemoration must involve more than this balancing act I am suggesting. It is unavoidably, I believe, a transaction that is required, and such a capacity for transaction, not just dialogically, but wider, that requires admission of new facts, new analysis, the creation of different suggestions, and even more importantly, the identification and excitement of unexplored possibilities, as we say in Irish, féidearthachtaí, and a readiness that the past having been transacted to discover willingness to build a future of solidarity and cohesion. What we must seek to achieve, I suggest, is a transparency of purpose, in an honesty of endeavour, in keeping open the possibility of plural interpretations of the past, but yet such an openness as will allow for future revision of accepted truths, based not only on new historical findings, but on an innovative ethical openness to differences of perspectives, a generosity and hospitality towards others. Indeed, such generosity, a willingness to be surprised at yourself, confronted, even destabilized in the assumptions of those foundational myths. We all need a source, I believe that we need a source. I have believed that we need a source, is, I believe, what is required if the act of remembering is to enable us to make a fist of living together in the present. Now, I know that all of you here, and reference has already been made to it, by the sheer fact of your presence in this emblematic site of reconciliation and trust between communities, are open, perhaps, to such a generous approach to remembering. And I, too, am mindful that we come together here in Corrymeela 50 years after that foundational conference of 1966, when the then Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, Terence O'Neill, made his passionate plea for dialogue across political and denominational barriers in Ireland. As he spoke, a protest was held outside of those who rejected any idea of political cooperation between groups within Northern Ireland, let alone between our Southern and Northern Irish institutions. We were then entering very painful times for the people of this island. Our gathering today, 50 years on, takes place in very different circumstances. We have come through the dark period of what some have called for ease, I think, the Troubles, and as we engage in dialogue this evening, I am confident that all of us are feeling somewhat optimistic. I suggest you do. And even I would suggest emboldened in the knowledge that there is a great deal to be gained in sharing a process of commemoration, including of some of the most divisive episodes in Irish history. I'm delighted that have been invited here for the form of the invitation which I received as President of Ireland. May I then thank John Hunter, Chair of Corrymeela Council, and to John Neal and Mr. McJemsey of the Irish Association for inviting me to address you. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to make a reflection with you all in Northern Ireland on what our commemoration of these defining events from 100 years ago has done, what it can do, what it may stir, and what it may heal, and what it may envision as hope or grief for this generation and those to come. In a number of my past speeches on the subject of remembering, I have, as some of you will know, made a case for it being an activity that must be launched within an ethical space. There exists a rich literature to support such an approach, and one on which I have often drawn. I am indebted in particular to the French philosopher, the late French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, and more as I come back to Hannah Arendt, two great thinkers who were more than helpful to us as to moral intention and as to method and as to the need, of course, to anticipate the inevitable moral consequences of an act of remembering. A central dimension of what I call ethical remembering, and one which I know I share with so many of you here, has been a refusal of any kind of conscious or unconscious amnesia. There is a literature that suggests, would it not be better to forget? I don't share that literature, for reasons we can discuss again. I think there's a refusal. I refuse conscious or unconscious amnesia for these reasons. I think of a speech I delivered in this theme in Queen's University and at last year at Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. I had problems about its morality. I insisted that to reject important, if painful, events of the past is to deny those affected by them recognition of their losses, and memories would be counterproductive, and the entire exercise might even be described as amoral. Rather than any false denial of the past, then, what can be achieved through ethical remembering is, I would suggest, a certain disposition, a way of relating, an invitation to transactional entry to the past that does not serve to form exclusive judgments or reinforce grievances, but rather to embrace the stories, the memories, and the pain of the other. It is the very opposite of that conversation between the citizen and Leopold Bloom in the pub. I think I have drawing from the philosophy of such as Paul Ricoeur, I have described this particular disposition as narrative hospitality. And I am using the word hospitality because of the significance I find in it across cultures and belief systems right across the world, and so relevant from the very most ancient times in sacred texts to the treatment of refugees today. Narrative hospitality, then, is an openness to the perspectives of the other, carved out at the very heart of public commentary and discourse. I think that this approach has the merit, I believe, of guarding us from glossing over differences or from jumping too quickly, even if for the most generous of reasons, from the conflictual to the consensual, arriving at a consensual without substance, perhaps, in our eagerness to reconcile diverging opinions and aspirations. Indeed, may I suggest humbly that if we were to dissolve differences too hastily, the long and troubled history of Northern Ireland would swiftly remind us that there is a hard core to collective feelings of belonging that have been taken into persons and communities. One that does not easily lend itself to suspension or disbandment. And that, I suggest, is the reason why I say it requires transaction. The concept of narrative hospitality, therefore, opens up, I believe, a most productive avenue for dealing with the past, in that it encourages all of us to lay down our own stories of past events, while at the same time listening with respect to other versions of those same events. Of course, it is likely that neither side will come out unaffected from such a process, and that the prism of the other will soon begin to dislodge and imprint a new shape on our old stories, adding to their complexity and texture, and luring us, we have to be careful, but then again it's worth taking the risk, to novel and yet unexplored places, inviting in intriguing characters, people we have never encountered, or perhaps not encountered sufficiently before. Perhaps most tantalizingly, can we learn through commemoration to understand ourselves better? I'd have to deal separately in another place with the theme of forgiveness in relation to that. The real difficulty there is, I wrote in one of my earliest poems, of coming to be able to forgive yourself, to be able to speak or transact of the concept of mercy for others, or more importantly, to receive love. So many are in that position. I think that what we can learn through commemoration then enables us to engage critically with our own assumptions and prejudices. We are blessed, I believe, to be able to go back to the events of 100 years ago with the help now of very many fine historians who have done so much to enrich our comprehension, yes, of both the Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme. There is now far more extensive scholarship on these two events as themselves and as connected and as shared context than was available, for example, 50 years ago. And this recent scholarship has both widened the lens of our understanding to include the broader political and intellectual context, including for a time something from all sides we lose, both the limitations and the gift of the Enlightenment, which would have influenced and flown on for definitions of republicanism. It has also refined our grasp, that scholarship has, of the complexity and texture of the period by drawing attention to the detail of individual experiences, including those of the marginalized. And we have to be careful. We recognize the children who died in Easter week, but we do so not for sentimental reasons, but as another illumination of the terrible consequences of war and conflict. As to the first dimension, the importance of context, all of us who engage in commemorative activity should endeavour to locate the shared ideals of the men and women of 100 years ago, as well as their diverging aspirations for Ireland's future within their wider historical circumstances. Without such a length and breadth of perspective, maybe, we cannot, I contend, even begin to understand the full impact and legacy of those events on our recent past, indeed on our present circumstances, indeed on what makes possible or difficult our futures. An appreciation of the complex and entangled strands of our past can help us to cope more effectively with the intricacies of our current situation. It is therefore as equally vital to hold together the Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme, the formation of the Ulster Volunteers and that of the Irish Volunteers, the Larne gun running and the Howth gun running, as it is to place all those events within the wider European and international context of a formal rift with the world's mightiest empires. After all, more than 100 years ago, the discussion all round Europe as insurrections and threatenings of freedom are taking place is of empires in context. 6 empires will enter the First World War, 2 will come out. And because maybe we have not criticized the concept sufficiently, we will move to another world war again. Those were days of heavily militaristic atmosphere, when reference to the virility of the nations at war and to ideas of blood sacrifice and martyrdom were prevalent, not just across the British Empire, but across Europe, and they contributed in no small measure to the disastrous descent into war which would claim so many lives. I often think of the reduction in height size for the recruitment of young soldiers, the 30% who were under 19 years of age when the war would end, the 50% who would be under 21 years, the circumstances of the social classes and the occupations and the crafts, the carpenters and the plumbers from all sides who formed those numbers. In Ireland, what was the atmosphere? It was a time when various groups were invoking what they saw as previous military incarnations of their present struggle, the insurrection of 1798 for the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Battle of the Boyne for the Unionists. And these both sides of that particular conflict, are just full of yet insufficiently interrogated assumptions drawn from the Enlightenment. Some of them, I think, because I have a certain limited view of what I call the Cartesian fallacy, invoking other older forms of truth. In Ireland, as elsewhere in Europe, we may remain challenged with the task of tracing and tackling the harmful and enduring remnants of ideologies, as well of exacerbated misplaced nationalism and militaristic triumphalism that held sway at the turn of the last century. An awareness of this wider context is important. And remember, I have summarised the previous paragraph by saying, indeed, as Connolly's estimation was, if this moment pass, we will not have another. We must seize it. An awareness of that wider context is important also, in that it enables us to read the past through the prism of the beliefs, the dreams, and the hopes and the fears of the women and men of the past, and thereby do better justice to anything we might have to say as to their motivations. We must appreciate the fact that these people acted in their own time, as we do or fail to do now in ours, uncertain of how events might unfold, or how they might be judged in the future, but motivated, we hope, by a particular sense of what for them was right. From the prism of separatist nationalism in Ireland of the early 20th century, there was an urgency to strike before the end of the war, lest it was imagined the prospect of realising independence would vanish yet again for a generation. For loyalists, the extreme demands of the war effort and the great losses suffered in Europe, as I was to tell them, and particularly of the young, and in the Middle East too, became increasingly linked with the political cause of unionism, and only heightened from their point of view their sense of betrayal when the rising erupted in Dublin. What was this Dublin that was producing people for both the insurrection and much in greater numbers for the war that was taking place? Dublin city was both the site of the rising, yes, the place of origin of so many Irish too, who died at the Somme. Dublin was a unique city located near the very heart of the seat of empire, but with tenements whose living conditions were described by contemporary medical and administrative investigations by that empire as being comparable to or worse than those of Calcutta. Social historians write of a city where 26,000 families lived in 5,000 tenements, and where 1,500 of those 5,000 tenements were classified by authorities as, the reports put it, the House of Commons, unfit for human habitation. A city where 5,000 families lived in but 2 rooms and 20,000 families in only 1 room, often taking a lodger. Those, if you like, circumstances that would move the work of Sean O'Casey, among others, and they're in the appendix to those studies of that period of O'Casey's work. Those are the living conditions from which soldiers were recruited for the First World War, and they were the conditions too that produced so many who took part in the lockout of 1913. And those conditions included those who had not been let back to work, and then it contacted those and others who would come to join the Irish Citizen Army, a much more disciplined force than, for example, the Irish Volunteers. Attention to context enables us finally and importantly to better grasp and render the complicated feelings of identity of so many of the men and women of our past. We now know that unionism, nationalism, republicanism, loyalism are all complex and variegated ideologies containing many different strains and with overlapping histories and origins. I think, for example, if I was asking Wolfe Tone, what are you, Wolfe Tone? And so on. and the complicated answer that you would get to such a question, and how informed it would be, both intellectually, morally, and intentionally. Political and cultural preferences have never been interchangeable with religion as some would have it today. It cannot be reduced to such simplicities, except with malintention, it seems to me. It is important to remember, for example, how historically the Republican tradition on this island included and cut across various strands of Protestant identity, and that many of the United Irishmen of 1798 were in fact Presbyterian dissenters. Such mixed composition also underpinned the cultural movement and the related and shared efforts to preserve and revive the Irish language and our island's rich musical tradition. And remember, we're in no period of unusual extremism. The end of the 18th century, the view held by Macpherson and others in relation to myth was that the Celtic mind wasn't capable of holding myth, and it would take the foundation of the Royal Irish Academy and wonderful work later to suggest, in fact, the richness of what was there for everybody. And I remember discussing with Peter Brooke some of this a long time ago when we were discussing his great aunt Charlotte Brooke. What happened to us all in the intervening decades for such important aspects of the intertwined history of the island to have been excised from the consciousness of so many of our citizens? Then too, why were the tens of thousands of men from the south of this island who took part in the First World War marginalised for so long in the official narratives of our republic? I could add in for that as well. Why were the women who had taken part in the Acts of Independence left out for so long? And even when the women participating come to be recognised, you get some truly extraordinary distinctions. Distinctions between what should be paid, for example, to the widows of the signatories and the other widows who were in the GPO but weren't signatories. And then the women who would be left out altogether. And a rather shameful exercise in relation to this whole question of pensions, which is for another day. I think we might ask as well, of this incredible, why were the tens of thousands, as I've said, not remembered? They numbered approximately 250,000, those who went and took part in that war. About 35,000 never came home. I think there is another very unusual footnote to all of this, and it is in the accounts of Major John McBride, for example, who in the Boer War finds people from both sides who had been in the same schoolroom class together, fighting with each other, as one of the confrontations, or skirmishes as they're called in McBride's work. In this regard, at least, we can say much has been done, much has been put to right. That historical omission, and I think we must all pay tribute to the powerful symbolism of particular acts of public commemoration that are there for us as example and that have taken place in recent years. Our artists, poets and writers have played a crucial part in that process. The creative work of Frank McGuinness or Sebastian Barry I have in mind, and we are invited to depart from simplistic explanations of identity and belonging, and to seek, as it were, evidence and expansion. The core to secure, as it were, an access to the core humanity of those who shared the terrible experience of war. If you want to see the difference in this, one is only to look at the visual art representations just immediately after World War I, after 50 years, and today. It is as if a population from the bottom of the trenches has been discovered, rather than the heroic indication of orders and uses of language about going over the top. We must all welcome, too, the great awakening of popular interest across this island in the terrible experiences of our grandfathers, great-grandfathers, during the First World War, and during other wars. I often to think the complicated experience in my own family in the terrible Civil War with my family on both sides, on different sides. Throughout this centenary year, so many of our citizens have also expressed great enthusiasm in recovering, indeed discovering, the multiple loyalties of so many men and women during the period, such as Bulmer Hobson, Roger Casement, or Francis Ledwidge, the Irish nationalist and poet. In the accounts of Bulmer Hobson, I find it very interesting, or in Roger Casement's attending the Fleadh na Glana, the Fields of the Glens. There are interesting stories of how those, in that big house that was held there as well, where in fact at the end of the day the policeman who had been coming to watch the whole affair would end up doing a dance with his, and somebody wearing his helmet. There are wonderful eccentricities in it all, and I think that they are not residual. They're indicating an impulse towards humanism which is endemic and which is valuable. The case of Francis Ledwidge, for example, is particularly relevant to the theme today, capturing, as it does, the profound entanglement between the Somme and the Rising. The son of a poor labourer, Francis Ledwidge enlisted with the British Army at the beginning of the war, hoping, like many others, that Ireland's loyal support to the British war effort would advance the cause of Irish independence. In this, I think he was following the example of Lord Dunsany. I think he had also hoped, however, in something for others to investigate, that it would raise his position in class to such a point at which he might be a reasonable prospect to sue for the hand in marriage of a farmer's daughter. The full history is yet to come of how the people in the cottages were viewed. Were they outside of nationalism, lesser nationalists? Were they modernizers? Were they modernizers of a difficult kind? He learned, Francis Ledwidge, of the execution of the leaders of the Easter Rising while he was recovering from his wounds in Manchester, a year before he was killed, alongside 5 comrades in a shell hole in Flanders. Ledwidge wrote what many regard as his significant poem, the best known poem of his known poems, in honour of his close friend Thomas MacDonagh, alluding in it to Tom MacDonagh's famous translation of the 18th century Irish poem by Cathal Bui Macguiraguna, On Bon On Bui, a von on bui shem a lay in the lead the canave, shielta the rish the rim. And he wrote, Ledwidge, he shall not hear the bittern cry in the wild sky where he is lain, nor voices of the sweeter birds above the wailing of the rain. A further very important gain, then, of all this recent scholarly work on both World War I and the Easter Rising has been to encourage us to take advantage, not only to be the shared advantage accorded by the passage of time, but in a most welcome sense to take account of the view, as I've described it already, the view from below. In relation to the Rising, much has been learned, as I've said, from the oral accounts of the time, as are now available in our public archives, and I thank the donors for that. And one cannot but be struck too by the emergence of a fine set of critical studies which have explored the specificity and complexity of female militancy, as exemplified, for example, in its day by such as Charles Stewart Parnell's sisters through the Ladies' Land League, and which manifested itself in the following century through the women's involvement in military action, and not simply in a nursing or supportive role. And then you have people who are moving between these narratives, such as Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. And it's very, very interesting in relation to Hannah's letter to Mr. de Valera much later about the role of women. And it is also interesting that those events of exclusion of people from pensions in the national struggle would only put right when in fact Edward Sheehy, would be the person in charge of this process in the Irish Civil Service in 1949 to 1955. The story of the women in the Rising, much of it is told in the women's own words, through interviews, diaries and memoirs. Yesterday I was in Mountjoy Jail, and there I was talking about Nell Humphreys. Now, Nell Humphreys was slapped into jail quite quickly after the Rising, as were nearly 3,000 others. She had distributed scapulars and miraculous medals to Patrick Pearse to encourage the people with him to pray. And as well as that, she was incarcerated. Then, of course, her brother was, so was her son. And she would bang metal plates together when she was later in Mountjoy to remind her fellow inmates that it was time for the rosary. I think that the role of these women, the women's words that we know now, a good question in historiography is, did we have these interviews, diaries and memoirs in 1966 and choose to ignore them? Or is it that they have been allowed in now and so forth, and if they have, it is a better historiography. And they inform us not only of the women who've played a leadership role in the insurrection, but on their friends, partners, dependents, relatives and survivors. We know, for example, that I think it is in the Plunkett's house that the brothers Patrick and Willie Pearse have a full breakfast. I don't know whether it would be the Belfast Fry, but it was near enough to it before they headed off for 1916. Again, from, I think, Brennan Whitmore, we know that some of the people, including some of my predecessors as President of Ireland, came to the JPO and stayed until 4 and said they were going home for their tea and didn't come back. I think in many ways, I think what was this, I do apologise, I must be disciplined because I will be, lest I delay you too long. I think today, if you like, I think that in relation to World War I, the recovering of the voices from below has shifted the focus from the heroic to intimacy, to the intimacies of the injuries endured, the generosity of those who experience life in the trenches. And I think let's just contrast, for example, the poems and the poets as they came to prominence in either 1964 and now the ones that have since 2014. Today we have a fuller sense of the unspeakable terror faced by the young men who found themselves catapulted into an industrial war of an unprecedented scale and nature. Those who were at Gallipoli and the Somme, Unionists and Nationalists, were there for different and often contrasting reasons, but their embodied experiences as they have written and told them were shared. Shared too was the grief of the families who lost their sons. In my preparations for World War I, commemorative ceremonies I've attended in Belgium and Turkey and in Dublin, and I will be participating on July the 1st in the Somme, I've drawn on the voices and experience of individual soldiers, such as reflected in the letters, diaries, memoirs, and of course in the literature and poetry they have bequeathed to us. It is worth noting that the First World War has given rise to both biographical and literary work that powerfully challenges the dangerous link between patriotic duty and heroic death. Poets such as Robert Graves or Blaise Cendrars, for example, have so memorably refuted the supposed ability of the human spirit to overlook gruesome everyday reality and bodily suffering. Such voices are, I would suggest, the best possible antidote against any heroic totalizing narrative. Their deep humanity continues to speak to us and to our present circumstances, echoing through time and space and resonating, for example, in such powerful places as Michael Longley's magnificent lines on forgiveness in Ceasefire, a poem I have often quoted. I must kneel at the feet of Achilles and kiss the hands of the man who killed my son. For those who read them, the personal narratives of the soldiers are not only extremely moving, but they have a unifying effect too. What we take from the diaries, I think, the letters and the memoirs, is that in the intimacy of trenches, under terrible bombardment, incredible expressions of human courage, encounters of intimacy, manifestations of care and compassion far beyond the ordinary, that maybe couldn't be delivered again, were delivered there on a daily basis. I think, and there were consequences in politics for all of this, as this shared experience for the ones who were able to come home brought about a fundamental change in politics. It introduced the concept of working class, and veterans into the political discourse. Ethical remembering calls on us, therefore, to reach out beyond the political framing of events to the humanity that was at once brutalized and magnified in the actions that took place on the battlefield of the Somme 100 years ago. I very much, as I've said, am looking forward as President of Ireland to honouring the memory of those who fell at the Somme when I travelled to France from Edinburgh and Glasgow on July the 1st. Doing so, it is not some abstract idea of sacrifice that I will be invoking, but these men's lives and their families and communities, the special circumstances of their lives together in the conditions of war, and also of the immense human potential that was lost in that war. Those futures that were taken not only from the combatants, but from their families and their communities. Indeed, a concern with the future that could have happened, and the future that is yet to take place, is at the heart of the commemorative process. Now, as I come to the final section of my paper, I have to say, I realise I am in somewhat hostile times intellectually for suggesting anything utopian. Even the Greek scholars are perhaps all gone. Utopos, getting to a new place. The business, I think, this concern with the future, indeed a concern with the future, I repeat, a future that could have happened, and the future that is yet to take place that I've just mentioned, that must be at the heart of the commemorative process. For with the distance of a century, surely we can find a new generosity towards the different strands of people's historical versions and go forward in a new way, acknowledging that the past has happened. That is not forgetting. It is understanding and acknowledging that the past has happened, but that the future remains alive, and with it possibilities yet unimagined, or as we would say in the Irish language, féidearthaí tí gan-teorann. As Mary-Louise Knott writes in her study of forgiveness in the work of Hannah Arendt, the ability to forgive and the ability to promise, to forgive and to promise, are the human characteristics that guarantee our freedom from being ruled by the past or the future. If forgiveness and forgetting did not exist, every past action would be irrevocable, and the present would be dominated by the past. If promising did not exist, the entire future would be unforeseeable, and the present would be dominated by all the fears and uncertainties of the future. The most dangerous position in Europe and our world at the present time is this feeling of incapable of acting to envisage different futures, as if we were in a sense trapped between inevitability that it is suggested to us in relation sometimes in economic terms is beyond our comprehension, and in other terms things that is beyond our exercise of power. That was the basis of the lecture I gave at New York University on the emergence of capitalism without democracy, drawing, as it were, on the new work on varieties of capitalism. Returning to forgiveness. Forgiveness, in other words, is a sort of political covenant. It robs a wrong of the past or the present of its future effectiveness without forgetting it. That's the nub of what I'm saying. We cannot, however, define the potentialities of our living together in cohesion and harmony on this island only in terms of any mere emergence from the past. We need, I argue, to go further and salvage the emancipatory promise encapsulated in so many of the defining events from our past. We need to recover these unfulfilled promises of the past that can still illuminate our present circumstances and guide our endeavours in the name of future generations. As Ricoeur put it, the past is not only what is bygone, that which has taken place and can no longer be changed. It also lives in the memory, thanks to arrows of futurity, which have not been fired, or whose trajectory has been uninterrupted. The unfulfilled future of the past forms perhaps the richest part of a tradition. In his very last essay before he died, John O'Donoghue wrote something similar in writing of possibility and drawing a distinction between imagination, privileged in the favour of the visual, to at the end of the day, as it were, sedimented in all of our lives, are the riches of the things that we wanted to do, the possibilities at which, as I said, the arrows of futurity were not fired. Marie-Louise North summarises this work, I think, of Ricoeur by simply saying, Ricoeur sees it as the historian's task to salvage forgotten possibilities for action and to liberate the unkept promises of the past from the ruins of history. In the many of their speeches about the Easter Rising that I have given recently, I have highlighted how the context of the time was one of limitless imagination, as surely is evidenced by what has been written about the cultural revival. It was a moment of conflict, yes, but also one surrounded by great creativity, idealism, cultural flourishing, intellectual vibrancy, gender being expressed, conversations between women in conditions of exclusion. And it had been like that for quite a few decades before the Rising, and then too also there had been experiments in cooperative proposals for the use of agriculture. The men and women of 1916, yes, were dedicated to independence, but many among them were also passionately involved with all of the social experiments of their time, and with movements, as I have said, such as the cooperative or the labour movements, which were committed to the construction of new models of living together. And some of these women, irrespective of any sexual relationship, lived together in partnership. We must ask ourselves as well, for example, why is the work of Eva Gore-Booth neglected for so long, over so many decades, now served by a very, very fun biography? They may have had mixed success. I think as well, it is very, very interesting for other discussions to go into is what happens during the War of Independence and very particularly in the Civil War. Did these social experiments, did these impulses, could they ever have been accommodated in nationalism? It is rather like saying to women as well, you know, it is when we've had full freedom, you will be able to have your freedom as well. And so on. These are all fine issues for the future. And I'm going to be disciplined. They may have had mixed success, these women of which I speak, but their utopian ethic and their emancipatory ideals found many inspiring expressions, and very particularly did something else, their strong sense of the public world, a sense of something for which we now are challenged. Remember, it's a different period of history that gave us the great public spaces, the performance and music in public spaces, the cultural spaces, and so forth. And also confidence in the idea that by exercising your vote, you could influence democracy and so forth. They are issues of the present that have flowed on now to us in a more acute form. But they were committed to the public world, of service to one's people and one's community. And their efforts, which were inclusive and all-island in their foundation and origins and project, can be a wellspring of inspiration for us today. Those men and women should be adduced and judged in terms of the ethical disposition that they represented in their time. It would be little less than a travesty to judge them by comparison to any models that came later of an authoritarian kind, as unfortunately some writers have unfairly done. Dear friends, we are here at Corrymeela, a site of healing, where the sensitive and quiet work of reconciliation, the building of trusting and respectful relationship between communities, is carried out, I know, on a daily basis. The great work performed by our two hosts this evening, the Irish Association, whose members have done so much to transform cultural, social and economic relations in this island since its foundation in 1938, and Corrymeela, a spiritual community founded in the hopeful spirit of the mid-1960s. Their work shows us that we cannot afford to view reconciliation and peace-building solely in terms of some narrow historical categories of green and orange, petrified in a process of endless reaction to one another's latest move, both action and reaction, neither criticised nor truly understood. Our island of Ireland is now home to people from many corners of the world, just as so for many centuries we Irish have moved to other parts of the world, renewing our sense of identity and belonging in contact with new peoples and new opportunities, new cultures and new music. The greatest collective task ahead of us is therefore, may I suggest humbly, that of crafting such a new, renewed, shared vision of citizenship as might guarantee the equal access of all to basic social goods and to their fair share of our island's prosperity. Indeed, when seeking to build a better future for the people of this island, when reflecting on how we can live together beyond 2016, the title of your seminar, we must acknowledge, as the report we are launching this evening invites us to do, that the greatest suffering in all parts of the island is caused by the denial of opportunity to some, based not on religious or political distinction, but on social exclusion, vulnerability, inequality, which characterize the lives of too many citizens in our cities and in our towns. The challenge for this generation is to achieve sufficiency and define sufficiency and social cohesion within the frame of our global responsibilities towards sustainability and reacting to the threat of climate change. As I conclude, may I conclude with a phrase from our own Irish again. Tarangin scale ella. One story leads to another. I remember when as a child in County Clare, a woman saying at the door, have you any story? You're no good, you have no story. Tarangin scale ella. One story leads to another. A simple phrase, but one that captures the dense and intertwined nature of our history on this small island. The fact that no single story can ever be separated from the story of the neighbour, the putative other, the stranger who will come to be a friend. Importantly, this phrase suggests too a further liberating possibility, the hope that our stories can lead us somewhere new. My hope is that they will, that together we may manage to find a new life in an ethic of solidarity and social cohesion that goes beyond what some have described as the necessity of healing any or just one set of historical differences. There are categories, remember, of what we have in us that are toxic at best and that have the capacity to create disaster. We cannot build an Ireland of peace and justice without, addressing the grievances of yesterday and their bogus origins. But neither can we hope to build new communities of sufficiency and happiness for all our people unless we seize resolutely on the realities and possibilities of today and tomorrow and unite efforts in tackling the great challenges of our time, challenges without borders, including, as I've said, climate change, sustainable development, global poverty. 800 million people in extreme poverty, and so many generations have failed. and added to them 1.2 billion children in malnourished, and 60 million displaced by conflicts in which diplomacy failed. And every day 53,000 children put onto roads because of natural disasters through refusal to deal with climate change, and 42,000 from conflicts, and we could go on and on. Climate change, sustainable development, global poverty. Poverty itself, that when I started as a young politician, 90% of which was in the poorest countries in the world, and that is today 72% of it in the mid-income countries, where in fact in the most developed countries we have food kitchens that are indicators of the great failure in relation to solidarity and inclusion. May I just say that, therefore, the consequences of conflict and extremism, there is an obligation, or rather, let's be positive, an opportunity to act as conscious global citizens by offering hospitality to that current suffering version of the other, to the refugees and the displaced. And may our united endeavours at living, may they well together in this new century strengthen our hope in the unrealised possibilities of being human, truly free in celebratory, joyous existence, and for others to be able to experience together the love too that peace will make possible. Gynny'n mi dînirach di marachtor le céile sin ish nua shas larme. Gydiochyd le céile con ar veideric di nachwyl cwlianta an gyffol a fwyntamach. Agus gymemish ser enach shri sana sasta, agus myt y gawal a fôr yn syl y dianta céile. Gymemed yn an laf hogand, agus yn am lil y céile, is sŵfnus yn siacoin. Corrymeela mag, I think.
I'd like to call on my colleague Chris McGimsey to say a word of thanks to President Higgins.
Thank you, John. It's hard to know what to say after having heard such a scholarly and erudite presentation as we've heard from the President. It's truly been, not only has it been a great experience for us, but it's been a privilege to sit and listen to your comments today. The chair at the start said about, and you referred to, this is where Terence O'Neill gave his speech, and it was called Ulster at the Crossroads. The whole concept behind this for Corrymeela and for the Irish's Association is that we don't get through the 2016 and on the 1st of January 2017 all go, geez, we made it. It's about looking forward, and we believe that Ireland is at the crossroads, and I think, as a Northern Ireland unionist, I must say I don't believe we could have anyone better as the head of state in the Republic of Ireland than yourself, sir. And I would join with everyone else and congratulate you on a superb speech which has moved us all very greatly. Thank you.